As 1863 opened, the Confederate cause had been buoyed by recent victories at Manassas and Fredericksburg. But in North Carolina, Union forces still held critical parts of the coast, including Roanoke Island, Plymouth, New Bern, and Beaufort. The Federal strategy would shift from the Tar Heel state to other theaters of the war, with efforts aimed at Virginia, South Carolina, and the Mississippi River. Meanwhile, Confederate leaders waited for an opportunity to retake New Bern and wrest away federal control of North Carolina's coast. Those hopes would be boosted in early 1863 by the appointment of Major General Daniel Harvey Hill to lead Confederate forces in North Carolina. Hill would work under the command of Lieutenant General James Longstreet. But the year would see the focus of the war shift as President Abraham Lincoln reshaped the nation's cause from restoring the Union to ending slavery. And the Southern mission would suffer from substantial manpower and economic losses in 1863. North Carolina would see some turmoil on the home front. During the Civil War, many North Carolinians remained loyal to the Union. That was particularly the case with people from the coastal and mountain regions. Several thousand white and black residents served with federal forces. Others sought to avoid the war, refused to be conscripted into Confederate military service, pay taxes, or provide goods and materials to support the rebellion. Those partisan tensions in the western part of the state led to tragedy in early 1863.
So the war in western North Carolina is fixing to become very real. It's January 1863, and a group of dissidents from the Laurel community are headed toward Marshall to raid the town. The Laurel community, Shelton Laurel community, had been a problem for many, many years, months, going back early into late 1861 or 1862. It had become a haven for dissidents and deserters and outliers and Unionists, largely from East Tennessee. When Jefferson Davis declared martial law in East Tennessee with the passage of the Conscription Act, a lot of men from East Tennessee made their way to Laurel to try and evade military service and the Confederate government. Numbers 800, 900, or 1,000 men sometimes in the Laurel community. And the only way they could survive was by raiding into the surrounding counties, as far away as Greenville, Tennessee, and Haywood and Yancey counties nearby, stealing food, stealing provisions, stealing guns, stealing clothes, whatever that they could take. It's January, it's cold. There had been a drought in late 1862. There was snow in various places along the mountains. And local men in the Laurel community had heard that there was salt in Marshall. The Confederate government had started selling salt to the various counties at price, and each county had a salt commissioner. And you needed salt. It was one of those commodities that everyone needed for their farms. If you were a local Confederate, you got salt. If you were a Unionist or a dissident out lying in the woods trying to evade the army, you didn't get salt. So a group of men, sometimes numbered at 50, we don't really know the number, raided into Marshall, January 1863. And they took the salt. But they didn't stop there. They raided local homes. They took furniture. They took clothes. They went to the home of Colonel Lawrence Allen of the 64th North Carolina. And they took provisions, and they took clothes, and they took the blankets off the beds of his sick kids. They made his wife strip down to nothing and took her clothes as well. And then they started heading back to the Laurel community, taking everything that they could find. There are even stories of them shooting local residents as they went along. word gets out that this raid has taken place. And the militia groups from various counties start organizing. They are called into service, and they move into the Laurel community, arresting, skirmishing with the men that are there, arresting others and sending them back to Asheville. There are more organized elements as well. Thomas's Legion is called up and moves through counties to our west looking for bands of deserters. The 64th North Carolina has just been sent out of East Tennessee into Madison County. Much of the 64th North Carolina is from this area, Madison and Haywood and the surrounding counties. Colonel Lawrence Allen in his command, and it's been his family that have been assaulted. His kids are the ones that are sick. It is his wife that has been robbed of everything that they own. They head into the Laurel community, and somebody from town, from Marshall, where Allen is from, arrives and says, your kids are not going to make it. And Allen, with a small escort, rides toward Marshall. He gets there in time for one of his kids. One of them has just died, and the other one is on the verge of death. And it's at that point he turns around and he heads back to the Laurel community.
The Confederates wreaked their vengeance on the town, whipping and torturing local women, burning houses, and killing livestock.
We don't know how many people are killed in the skirmishes or wounded in the skirmishes in Shelton, Laurel in January of 1863. We don't know how many people have been captured total. We know that Allen turns operations over to Lieutenant Colonel Keith, and Keith takes 15 men, some young, some old. They've been captured in the area, and they start to move toward Knoxville, Tennessee, where the idea is to turn these prisoners over to the district court system to be tried. But everybody knows that the judge in Knoxville, the Confederate judge in Knoxville, is sympathetic with the Unionists. Around January 18th, 1863, Lieutenant Colonel Keith now has 13 prisoners. 2 have escaped. And he takes these prisoners not far out of the Laurel community, lines them up, and begins to execute those prisoners.
The captives, ranging in age from 13 to 60, were forced to kneel before they were executed and tossed into a shallow grave. Some died pleading for mercy. Others were shot multiple times. Several of the murdered men and boys were members of the Shelton family.
Word soon gets out. Augustus Merriman, who's solicitor for Western North Carolina, sends word to Governor Zebulon Baird Vance saying, something has happened. I don't have good reports about it. I'm not sure exactly, but something bad has happened. And Merriman continues to investigate. Now, it's not clear if he ever talked to anyone in the 64th North Carolina or anyone that was an eyewitness to these events, but word gets out, and he writes Vance back about how these men, local men from Madison County, North Carolina residents, have been executed. Now, some of them were Confederate deserters, some of them were young men, but it's wrong regardless. And Vance believes that, and he starts writing notes to various people saying, various government officials saying, we want justice. Where is Lieutenant Colonel Keith? Where is Colonel Allen? These men need to be arrested and turned over to civilian courts and prosecuted, and that never happens.
Brigadier General Henry Heath, Allen's superior, and who Keith claimed had approved the executions, avoided censure. Allen was given a 6-month suspension from the Army. Keith fled into the mountains. The fugitive Keith was eventually caught by Union troops and indicted on charges of murder. He was imprisoned for 2 years before relocating to Arkansas after the war. Confederate Lieutenant General James Longstreet took command of the Department of Virginia and North Carolina in February 1863 and launched his Tidewater operations. That plan included protecting Richmond and Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, retaking coastal forts and territory, and gathering supplies and men. The operations in coastal North Carolina led by Major General D.H. Hill were tied to efforts in southeastern Virginia aimed at putting Union forces on the defensive.
On March 13, 1863, Major General Daniel H. Hill advanced to attack New Bern with approximately 12,000 Confederate troops. Major General John G. Foster, the Union commander, held the town with greatly reduced force as he had sent troops to operations in South Carolina.
Hill's attack on New Bern involved an infantry assault from the southwest, a cavalry advance to cut the railroad line and isolate the Federal garrison, and heavy cannon fire from the north.
As part of the operations, Brigadier General James J. Pettigrew had to move about 3,000 men some 60 miles from Goldsboro to Fort Anderson in heavy rains along muddy roads. Fort Anderson is a Union-constructed earthwork that was named in honor of Lieutenant Colonel Hiram Anderson, who commanded the garrison. The approximate dimensions were 15 feet tall, protected in front by a ditch of 8 feet deep by 12 feet wide, and along with its strong natural fortifications and prominence out into the Neuse River, made it nigh impossible for anyone to slip past unnoticed. Fort Anderson was defended by the 92nd New York Infantry Regiment and was home to some 200 to 300 men.
On the afternoon of March 13th, North Carolinians led by Brigadier General Junius Daniel overran a Union outpost at Deep Gully, 8 miles southwest of New Bern. While the Confederates had pushed the Federals from Deep Gully and held off a counterattack by 3 Massachusetts regiments, the Southerners failed to advance further.
On the morning of the 14th, Pettigrew's cannons opened fire on the surprise defenders here at Fort Anderson and the protecting gunboats from the river. Despite heavy shelling, the Confederates were unable to get the defenders to surrender the fort or drive away the gunboats protecting from the river. With every tent riddled with holes, 2 of 5 horses dead, a handful of casualties, mishaps from the guarding gunships, and a slew of other unfortunate incidents, the Union forces were able to withstand the assault and prevail. Accordingly, Pettigrew was forced to abandon his assault and retire along the same route in which he had advanced.
Because Pettigrew's success was essential to the operation, Hill had no choice but to withdraw. Despite his failure to recapture New Bern, Hill was able to seize unguarded food wagons from Union forces and suffered few casualties. He then launched a similar operation against Washington, North Carolina, 2 weeks later. Stresses related to the Civil War reached beyond the battlefield and into Tar Heel soldiers' homes and families. Early in the war, Southern volunteers were mostly young and unmarried men. As the fight dragged on and more soldiers were needed, the enlistment of older men with families increased. The absence of husbands and fathers serving in the Confederate Army often put serious economic stresses on the families they left behind. Hardships faced by military families boiled over in the Piedmont in the spring of 1863 in the form of what has been called a bread riot. On March 18th, about 50 women, identified as mothers and wives of soldiers, broke into shops in Salisbury. The female raiders claimed that local merchants were profiteering by improperly hiking the price of groceries. When shopkeepers refused to sell the goods at government prices, the women broke into one shop with hatchets and threatened other sellers. The mob took 23 barrels of flour, along with some molasses, salt, and cash from Salisbury stores, but none of the women were prosecuted. The Salisbury bread riot and another similar incident in Richmond just about 2 weeks later were indicative of the stress families faced on the Southern home front. Following his failed attack on New Bern, Confederate Major General D.H. Hill turned his sights on a secondary target, Washington, North Carolina, some 40 miles to the north. Union Major General John G. Foster led the town's defense with a garrison of about 1,200 soldiers. That included a company of the 1st North Carolina Union Volunteers, along with local black men who had been armed for the town's defense. On March 30th, 1863, Confederates began to lay siege to Washington, as they lacked the element of surprise, and a direct assault would have resulted in heavy casualties. To prevent the Federals from sending reinforcements and supplies from New Bern, Hill posted cannon along the Tar River and 2 brigades south of the town. With the defenders surrounded, the Confederates foraged for provisions in the area. A few skirmishes took place during the siege, but most of the exchanges involved Union cannon and gunboats and Confederate batteries. Attempts to reinforce and resupply the garrison at Washington failed as the rebel batteries drove off Union vessels attempting to offer aid. An overland relief effort involving about 8,000 men, led by Brigadier General Francis B. Spinola, turned around after a fight on April 9th with Confederates at Blunt's Creek, 16 miles south of Washington. On April 13th, a Federal ship, the USS Escort, managed to run the Confederate gantlet of guns along the river and brought supplies and reinforcements to the defenders. A few days later, Hill lifted the siege as Longstreet sought troops to aid in an attack on Suffolk, Virginia. The recall of Confederate forces to Virginia would make it easier for the Federals to carry out expeditions and raids throughout eastern North Carolina. In June 1863, the North Carolina coast was the scene of one of the largest escapes of Confederate prisoners of war. Some 100 captured Confederate officers were being moved from Norfolk, Virginia, to Fort Delaware aboard the Federal steamer Maple Leaf. About half of the prisoners had been transported recently from New Orleans. That group included Oliver J. Semmes, son of the famous Captain Raphael Semmes. Shortly after leaving Norfolk, the captives overpowered their guards and headed towards the southern Virginia shore. About 70 of the Confederate officers, some now armed with captured weapons, escaped on small boats and made their way to the Currituck Banks in North Carolina. The remaining prisoners were sick or wounded and were returned to captivity. The escapees broke up into smaller groups and were pursued by Union cavalry and gunboats as they fanned out across northeastern North Carolina. Local citizens and soldiers with the 68th North Carolina Infantry helped hide and care for the former POWs, who all managed to reach the safety of Confederate lines. The Maple Leaf continued to serve as a Federal transport until it struck a mine near Jacksonville, Florida, in April 1864. The Emancipation Proclamation authorized the recruitment of black volunteers for Federal service beginning January 1, 1863. In May of that year, Brigadier General Edward A. Wild began recruiting for the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers. The unit was to be led by James Beecher, the half-brother of writer Harriet Beecher Stowe, the famed author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Wild, who had lost an arm at South Mountain in September 1862, enlisted men in the New Bern area, which was home to a large population of African Americans.
1863, the Emancipation Proclamation takes effect. Freedom seekers throughout the South and eastern North Carolina find their way evading slave dogs through swamps and the brack to reach the destination known as James City. In James City, here on the banks of the Neuse River, becomes an oasis of freedom. Freedom seekers from nearby plantations, turpentine orchards, flock to the Union camp of General Burnside's expedition to eastern North Carolina after the March 1862 Battle of New Bern. Those freedom seekers included men like William Henry Singleton, who was formerly enslaved here in Craven County, North Carolina. And the only means through which he could attain his freedom was through permission of his slaveholder working as part of the Confederate Army. And after the December 1862 Battle of Kingston, North Carolina, Singleton comes down the Southwest Creek out of Lenoir County into Craven County through one of these tributaries and finds his way into James City, where Union authorities immediately suspect him as a spy. Attempting to assuage their fears, he informs them of the Confederates' whereabouts to no avail. However, he's placed in the brig until Confederate officers, under the guise of the contraband edict, come to James City requesting his release and return to the Confederate Army. But this very gesture vets Singleton and allows him to become the first soldier to enroll in what will become the 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry. And the 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry is federalized as the 35th United States Colored Troops just before the February 1864 Battle of Salisbury, the only Civil War campaign in the state of Florida. Another soldier in that regiment, Luke Martin, had also escaped slavery, seeking freedom from Martin County, North Carolina, and the Pungo River bordering Washington County near the present-day town of Plymouth. And in January and February and March of 1863, swims through frigid waters, swamps evading bears, snakes, and alligators, slave patrols with vicious dogs and Confederate home guards, and gets to James City and enrolls in the 1st North Carolina on the first day of enlistment, May 18th, 1863.
The regiment was led by white officers, per government policy, but Beecher's initial staff included Major John DeGrasse, the first black doctor admitted to a medical society in the United States. The new regiment was joined by others to become part of Wild's African Brigade, headquartered in Norfolk, Virginia. In early December 1863, Wild decided to launch a two-pronged attack into areas of eastern North Carolina patrolled by Confederate guerrillas to demonstrate the effectiveness of his men. Nearly 2,000 soldiers moved to South Mills and on to Elizabeth City in the first independent combat action taken by what were known at the time as U.S. colored troops. Wild's men burned partisan camps and homesteads and liberated hundreds of slaves during their raid. Some 200,000 U.S. colored troops served during the second half of the Civil War. More than 5,000 of those came from North Carolina.
The 2nd North Carolina Colored Infantry is raised also here in James City, a camp named for Union General Horace James on the outskirts of New Bern, where the 2nd North Carolina Colored Infantry will be federalized into the 36th United States Colored Troop, mainly seeing action in the Overland Campaign of 1864 in southeastern Virginia. And the 36th United States Colored Troop was the absolute first Union regiment to enter the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, to capture that city and help to end the war in the Old Dominion. For its exploits, the United States War Department reassigns the 36th U.S. Colored Troop from Richmond, Virginia, to be part of the detail of Union General Gordon Granger's campaign to Galveston, Texas, where he arrives there at the Bay on June 19, 1865, and what later becomes known as Juneteenth, or the campaign to spread the news of the Emancipation Proclamation and the circulation and the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution outlawing slavery. Then there's the 3rd North Carolina Colored Infantry, which was federalized as the 37th United States Colored Troops. And men like Private Charles Jones would leave nearby swamps of Jones County and Trenton to arrive here at James City, where they would also enroll in the 37th, seeing duty mainly in the Carolinas. A Union artillery regiment, the 14th United States Colored Heavy Artillery, will be raised heading east down the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad line from New Bern to the newly established town of Morehead City, which was founded in 1860 upon the completion of that Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad from the Confederate hub and railroad hub of Goldsboro, where in Goldsboro, which becomes the objective of Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's campaign, not only to the sea at Savannah, Georgia, but through the Carolinas, whose main objective was to capture the brand new shiny city of Goldsboro, North Carolina, a transportation and railroad hub supplying both General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and Confederate General Johnston's Army in the Carolinas. A vital supply line that is captured in March of 1865 by Sherman, where in March that same month, the United States War Department authorizes the 135th United States Colored Troops regiments, which builds the first continuous road from that new city of Goldsboro to the state capital of Raleigh through these swamps, building corduroy roads, allowing the 100,000 troops of General Sherman, along with General Terry and Union General Kilpatrick coming up from Fort Fisher, where they merge outside of Goldsboro to build that first road that results in the capture and the end of the war in April 1865 in Raleigh, North Carolina. There were other United States Colored Troop regiments raised with soldiers in North Carolina, from North Carolina, most namely the 2nd United States Colored Cavalry, which is raised out of portions of northeastern North Carolina and southeastern Virginia with its equestrian culture. And that regiment is enrolled in Norfolk, Virginia. And they're also part of the contingency of Union troops who captured Richmond along with the 36 U.S. colored troops to help end the war, with men like Parker David Robbins and his brother Augustus Robbins out of Hertford County, North Carolina, where the 2nd U.S. Colored Cavalry also becomes part of what we now call Juneteenth.
African American soldiers saw action in a number of critical battles, including at Fort Fisher, North Carolina.
Helping to earn their freedom, end the scourge of slavery on our land, and bring freedom for all. And in the words of Frederick Douglass, the Emancipation Proclamation was like a burst of freedom. Freedom for all.
But lingering racial prejudice would stymie the military careers of many of those men who had fought for the Union. In mid-July 1863, Union Brigadier General Edward E. Potter launched a remarkable raid that covered more than 200 miles in 6 days. Potter's expedition had the primary objective of destroying the railroad bridge at Rocky Mount. The Federals aimed to sever a critical Confederate supply line. Leaving New Bern, Potter's force moved to Swift Creek Village, now known as Vanceboro. The burg had recently been occupied by a Union infantry brigade. The horsemen arrived in Greenville on July 19th, looting the town, destroying the bridge over the Tar River, and freeing 24 black men caught while they were trying to reach Union lines. Potter then split his force of about 800 men. One detachment was sent to Rocky Mount. The other moved on Tarboro. At Tarboro, the Federals destroyed a Confederate ironclad that was under construction. They also burned 2 captured steamboats, several railroad cars, warehouses, and other structures, as well as cotton and medical supplies. At Rocky Mount, a train was captured and more supplies and property were destroyed. Local Confederate forces finally caught up with Potter's men, and a series of skirmishes ensued. The Federals withdrew to New Bern after destroying or capturing vast quantities of supplies, severing communication lines, and taking dozens of Confederates prisoner. 300 formerly enslaved people also were brought back to Union lines in the raid. Total Federal casualties were listed as fewer than 75 killed, wounded, and captured. Less than a week later, Union cavalry under Colonel Samuel Spear launched another raid in an attempt to destroy the railroad bridge on the Roanoke River at Weldon. Spear and his men occupied the town of Jackson, but withdrew without destroying the bridge in the face of Confederate resistance. The Union forays into North Carolina's interior created turmoil among the citizens and leaders of the state. In July 1863, Governor Zebulon Vance officially ordered breastworks and gun emplacements to be built around Raleigh. Construction on certain defensive positions at strategic points around the capital city had begun several months before. But citizen concerns over recent federal raids in nearby towns added urgency to the effort. Black laborers, mostly enslaved men, built the bulk of the walls and entrenchments that would circle the city. Cannon emplacements were set about every 300 yards. The works were designed to protect 2 railroad depots and other important structures in Raleigh. Despite the defensive ring around the city, Raleigh would be surrendered without a fight when Union General William T. Sherman approached in April 1865. Remnants of the earthen walls can still be seen in certain areas of the capital. Although no major battles were fought in western North Carolina, the region was the site of raids by bushwhackers and guerrillas throughout the war. Loyalties there were divided, and units from both Union and Confederate forces operated in those western counties. In the fall of 1863, local Unionists would clash with local Confederates in Madison County.
It's October 1863, and a new regiment, the 2nd North Carolina Mounted Infantry, has been organized. It's a federal regiment made up of dissidents, of Confederate deserters, men from western North Carolina and East Tennessee. They have come into western North Carolina to do a little recruiting, taking men from Madison, Haywood, and Jackson counties. At the same time, they're looking for horses so they can mount their command. Confederate forces in western North Carolina learn about this, and they begin to organize in portions of the 64th North Carolina troops under Colonel Allen and portions of the 14th Battalion North Carolina Cavalry under John Woodfin begin to move in this direction.
The Federals took up defensive positions in the Warm Springs Hotel, along Spring Creek, and on nearby high ground.
Confederate forces advance, figure out what they're up against, fall back, and then a couple of days later, on October 20th of 1863, launch their attack. It's a skirmish that goes on for most of the day. Toward the end of the skirmish, Allen, Woodfin, and a couple of others have been cut off from their command. Woodfin is shot and killed, his body left in the road, and is later stripped of his valuables, including his watch. Allen escapes, but the only way he can escape is by going up one of these mountains that surround us. It takes him several days to get back to his command. For the Federals, it's another victory in western North Carolina.
Several additional skirmishes followed, with the 5th Indiana Cavalry and a detachment of the 25th North Carolina also engaged. Both sides suffered several casualties. Western North Carolina would see a number of other fights throughout the war as Federal cavalry units, including those under George Kirk and George Stoneman, carried out raids in the region. Before the Civil War, female family members were the primary caregivers to the sick and wounded in North Carolina. A local doctor might be called upon in more severe cases. Overall, the state lacked an adequate hospital system to treat the huge numbers of the injured and ill that the war would bring.
Actually, the only hospitals that did exist were the two that were run by the federal government. They were merchant mariner hospitals, the marine hospitals at Portsmouth Island over towards Ocracoke, and down on the lower Cape Fear at the port city of Wilmington. The other hospital that existed was in Raleigh, but it was really designed for, it was established as the State Mental Asylum by Dorothea Dix.
The Confederate Medical Department was created in February 1861. It was patterned along the lines of the U.S. Army model.
Now, when we look at Civil War hospitals, it's important that we categorize them, and I like to say follow the money trail, because not all Civil War hospitals were funded and operated by the Confederate Army. Because of this misconception at the beginning of the conflict, and with thousands of soldiers sick and wounded, it was privately funded, privately operated organizations, like here in New Bern, the Ladies Soldiers Society here, would establish a private hospital. The funding for this hospital, the women would raise money. Local physicians, not in the Army, would come by and take care of the sick. Also filling this gap was Raleigh. and the North Carolina Medical Department, who had its own Surgeon General, which did not answer to Richmond and to the Surgeon General of the Confederate Army. These hospitals, initially established by the state of North Carolina, were fully funded by North Carolina, with surgeons with governor's commissions. These initial hospitals North Carolina will fund is 2 in Petersburg, Virginia, and then one later on, along kind of working with the government in Richmond. Why? Because the vast majority of regiments formed early in the war went to Virginia to serve. Down here in North Carolina, those dozen or so regiments that remain in the state are primarily going to be focused in the coastal defenses of North Carolina, down around Wilmington, here in New Bern, Roanoke Island, Washington. Because of this large concentration of forces, there will be a need for hospitals. Now, the other third category of hospitals, which will become on later with the Confederate Army, managed by the Surgeon General, Samuel Preston Moore. By the spring and summer of '62, the Confederate government finally kind of gets this act together when it comes to the proper healthcare system for its soldiers. And you will see a lot of these early privately run hospitals, state-run hospitals, are turned over to the Confederate government. And now they technically belong to the Confederate Medical Department. And their funding will come from Richmond, from the Confederate Congress of appropriations to the War Department. So we have our 3 types: privately operated, state operated, and then I call government, but essentially Confederate Medical Department.
The CSA operated varying types of military hospitals. The facilities had differing sizes and purposes.
Now, when we look at those 3 categories, we now need to look to define the types of hospitals that will be. For example, here in New Bern, just to the immediate north up the river here, the Neuse River, about a mile or so, was the 7th North Carolina, where it was encamped initially in the war. Each regiment had its own surgeon, and they would establish what we would call a camp hospital. Camp hospitals are very temporary in nature because as the regiment moves, like the 7th North Carolina, will eventually relocate from here down to the Carolina City, Fort Macon, Morehead City area, down along the coast in Carteret County. That hospital will move with it. We also have in some of our larger garrison-type locations like Goldsboro and Wilmington and Raleigh, there will be a need for what is called a post hospital. Now, post hospitals serve those soldiers that serve in the Confederate Army, but let's say they're with the Quartermaster Department, the Commissary Department, the Ordnance Department. They don't have a regimental surgeon. They don't belong to a regiment. So where do they go when they wake up in the morning with a sore throat and a fever? Well, typically these larger garrison-type operations would have a post hospital, and that's where they would go, probably several beds. And once, if the doctor that's assigned there determines that they need to move up to the next echelon of care, which is a general hospital, those soldiers would be transferred to. Now, the term general hospital, this is your much larger, like, for example, here in New Bern on Craven Street, the Branch General Hospital had 220 beds. It was multi-story high. Now, the term general means that anybody can go there. Whether you're from North Carolina, if you're in a Georgia regiment, Tennessee regiment, Virginia regiment, a general hospital by law is supposed to take you in and take care of you. So hence you start to see the term general hospital in these much larger hospitals. And by the end of the war, Richmond, for example, several of the general hospitals up there, we're talking 4,000 or 5,000 bed capacity. Here in North Carolina, our general hospitals never really get larger than about 400 to 500 bed capacity. The other types of hospitals you may have would be a field hospital. For example, out of New Bern in December of '62, General Foster's raid towards Goldsboro. He's going to fight at the Battle of Kinston, Whitehall, then ultimately along the Neuse River at the Battle of Goldsboro Bridge. Now, along the way, soldiers are going to get injured. They're going to become wounded. And there may be a need to occupy a private residence at that time. just to use, for example, as the Army stops for the night, instead of setting up tents, why don't we take over Mr. Smith's house and put all our sick and wounded in there, and then we'll pick up and move back towards New Bern. So hence the term field hospital. Another type of hospital that you will see mentioned occasionally in the Civil War is more of a more temporary nature. And usually it's associated with some type of communicable disease like yellow fever or smallpox. You have these epidemics that break out. For example, down in Wilmington the summer of '62, and then even up here in New Bern, they had a yellow fever outbreak with the Union forces up here. Smallpox is another example. There's a need to quarantine these people away from the population. So hence, a town outside a private residence or building outside the town limits of New Bern or Wilmington may be occupied temporarily as a pest house or essentially a quarantine type. And of course, the other type of hospital, specialty wise, deals primarily with those free blacks and enslaved individuals that are impressed from their slaveholders to work for the Confederate government, work for the Confederate Army. And we see them digging trenches around Goldsboro, Fort Anderson, Fort Fisher, those kind of things. There's incumbent upon the Confederate Army to make sure that these individuals do not die of sickness, or the Confederate government is now liable for property loss to that enslaver. So typically down around Smithfield, the first one, and then in Wilmington, and then later on the war, there's some mention of possibly Goldsboro and even Salisbury, these Confederate Army Negro hospitals as they were officially designated. Another major kind of hospital, which is specific just to the Confederate Army, and we have several here in North Carolina, that was established in the spring and summer of '62, are wayside hospitals. Wayside hospitals, the whole concept was the ladies in South Carolina, for example, there's a lot of heavy fighting going on in Virginia, and there's a need to clear out, to make room in the hospitals up there, bed space. So they would furlough soldiers home back down to Georgia and South Carolina or to North Carolina, and for 30, 40 days, then they'd come back to the Army. But in the meantime, these soldiers had to travel. They're transient in nature. And what the ladies in South Carolina discovered was you have these soldiers, passing through South Carolina on their way home to Georgia, but they're having to wait overnight at a rail depot in the middle of the winter with no food. They may have a bandage or dressing that needs to get redone, or they may catch a common cold along the way. And the ladies established these wayside hospitals. Now they're at the beginning, when they're first established, they're privately operated. Once again, private funds are running these. One of the first ones we have here are down in Wilmington, and over here in Charlotte, North Carolina, we have wayside hospitals that are established, as well as Salisbury, Raleigh. Now, eventually the Confederate government says, you know what, this is a good idea. And later in '62, the Confederate government will make it mandatory that wayside hospitals be established by the Confederate Army. So in the spring of '63, you see wayside hospitals that were formerly privately run that are now taken over by the Confederate government. A perfect example is the wayside over in Salisbury, North Carolina. It's taken over by the Confederate Army.
At the start of the war, the Confederate Army used existing structures as general hospitals. They were usually more permanent and often located near transportation centers. In North Carolina, the first general hospitals were in former maritime facilities on the coast at Wilmington and what is now Southport. A camp hospital in Raleigh, the center for the state's military operations, was soon converted to a general hospital as well.
Now up here in New Bern, where a number of forces are concentrated for the defenses in this region, the need for a general hospital occurs. And in September of '61, immediately behind my rear here, was the Sutham store. And the ladies, the Soldiers Society here, Aid Society here in New Bern, created a privately operated hospital in the generosity of Mr. Sutham.
who gave up his building here on Hancock Street immediately to my rear. Now it's very small, hence the need later on, towards the end of the year in January '62, the need for the much larger Confederate General Hospital located back there on Craven Street. By January of 1862, the number of Confederate forces stationed along the coast of North Carolina, both at Wilmington and here in New Bern, required the establishment of additional general hospitals. Here in New Bern, immediately to my rear, is the Stephen Brick Block building that was leased by the Confederate Army from Mrs. Riggs, and it served as a second general hospital here in New Bern. Now this hospital will operate up through the Battle of New Bern in March of '62. Meanwhile, down in Wilmington, because of the number of forces, another larger general hospital was established as well. We also have general hospitals established in the town of Washington, North Carolina, just north of New Bern, up along the river. And down around Morehead City, in what was then called Carolina City, an additional general hospital is established.
In early 1862, Union General Ambrose Burnside launched an expedition against coastal targets in North Carolina, including the vital seaport of New Bern.
Now, at the time of the battle, Assistant Surgeon Thomas G. Martin, who had been laboring through the night to remove the sick to make room for potentially wounded men coming from the battle, he steps out and looks out and observes out the front door of the hospital here. He noticed along the railroad track here the 35th North Carolina and several of the local militia units all running to the north. Several blocks away from here is the railroad depot, where they hope to jump on a train and escape the Union capture of New Bern. Now, once the Federals occupy New Bern, they will not utilize the Noose General Hospital. Apparently, it was just too small. A very small structure based upon the pictures we have of it. They did not utilize it, but they will utilize the larger general hospital over on Craven Street.
With the loss of the hospitals in New Bern, Washington, and other coastal locations, the North Carolina hospital system would spread along the railway lines to Goldsboro, Wilson, Weldon, and Raleigh, and westward toward High Point, Greensboro, and Charlotte. By December of 1863, North Carolina had established a network of care to treat its sick and wounded soldiers, and had become a major hospital center for the Army of Northern Virginia. Women and African Americans provided a significant portion of the care North Carolina's soldiers received during the Civil War. (1863) was considered the high water mark of the Confederacy. Major Union victories at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga put the Confederates on the defensive strategically. Both sides also suffered massive casualties during those fights, another advantage for the Federal cause, as it had much more manpower. The economic costs also were mounting for the Southern states, and Tar Heel soldiers and civilians alike became weary of the conflict. Confederate conscription efforts also were feeding disenchantment. In North Carolina, discontent with Governor Zebulon Vance and the Confederate government was on the rise. Peace advocates, including the editor of the Standard, William B. Holden, had become increasingly vocal. But the bulk of Confederate territory was untouched, and the principal Southern armies remained strong. And among Northerners, discontent with the war also was mounting. With primary Union efforts focused elsewhere, Confederate forces in North Carolina would go on the offensive in 1864, trying to recover some of the territory occupied by Federals since 1862.